After that, my family, with much trouble, had the visas to the United States. We had to find a sponsor who was a steel worker in Gary, Indiana, who had to guarantee us. And us were my father, my mother, my grandmother, and my aunt, plus myself. All of us had to be guaranteed for life before we could enter the United States legally. So we had the visa and the tickets to fly over there. But at the last minute, all the planes were confiscated by the Shanghai Shak's government and for their own use to escape to Taiwan. And we were left stranded in the airport without a job, without an address, without a valid visa, and no funds. That's the first time in my life when I really panicked. Before then, we had some tough times with the Japanese occupation of Shanghai, which took place in 1940. The Japanese appeared in 1939. There were curfews. We had to block our windows and live in fear. My uncle, my mother's brother, had been working for the British sector, the Public Works Department, PWD, in Shanghai, and got himself an English passport, which made him liable to go to a concentration camp, which he did. We visited him, and in the concentration camp, he was growing enough food in the little plot of land that was allowed the prisoners of the Japanese to feed not only himself and his family, but also us. So we went to a prison camp in order to get good food. Bishop John had to live through all that. He didn't believe in curfews and would go out on foot past all the Japanese guards who were supposed to arrest him or shoot him. They let him go because of his imposing personality. He was never harmed by anybody. He went to visit hospitals. And he couldn't tell us about who tried to stop him. He also was on the old calendar and didn't believe in daylight saving time. So many of the church holidays were celebrated on the wrong day. But that was what he was. Among, since we are back to Bishop John, among his other peculiarities, he did build or complete 2 enormous cathedrals, one in Shanghai, which was large enough to have 6,000 people crammed into it, and later a smaller replica in San Francisco on Geary Boulevard. In Shanghai, the cathedral was built by penniless Russian emigres, penny by penny, but was a fabulous building. It occupied a whole square block. It had a belfry with tower with bells, which I was allowed to ring once a year. Maybe that's the reason I'm deaf. The result, the bells were so loud. Bishop John also made sure there was a playing field for children as part of the church compound, and he insisted that children engage in sport and socializing so that they could grow up as normal children. He took care of alcoholics. There were many drug addicts. There were many. One family member was both. And derelicts, street people, abandoned children, orphans, abandoned babies. Bishop John went to the trouble of finding shelter for them, built an orphanage, and scrounged around for money to get the children fed and educated and brought up as normal children. He also had the disconcerting habit of stopping in his tracks when he came across a person who was suffering bodily or spiritually, and out on the street, possibly a derelict. Bishop John dropped everything he was doing and stood by to help the man because he felt it was a human being in distress. He never asked whether the person was Orthodox or Christian, a criminal, evil. It was a human being, and he felt it his duty, whether the person wanted it or not, whether the person needed it or not, or was even aware of his problems. He stood by until the person could be taken care of. That made a lot of enemies for St. John, people who thought he was exceeding his bounds as a bishop, and there was criticism and even lawsuits against him. He survived all of them and kept going his way no matter what. In the church itself, since we're on the topic, as I've mentioned, I had to pass it at least 2 times a day, sometimes 4 times a day. I always tried the doors to see if they were open. If they were open, I would begin to see what was going on. Before going in, quite often there was a street person sprawled across the steps of the main entrance. And Bishop John's jurisdiction, he was allowed to do so. Everybody had to step over him without disturbing him on their way into church and services. Everybody, including Bishop John. The man was a privileged beggar. He felt he was unworthy to go into church, but he had nowhere else to go. On rainy days, he was allowed to go in a few steps inside and survive in that manner. That's typical of St. John. Inside the church, I had my favorite corner between columns where the icons were those of St. Panteleimon the Healer, Boris and Gleb, and Vera, Nadezhda, and Lubov. I loved that corner because I could hide in it and observe the people in the church without being seen. There's one particular evening I remember. I stood in my favorite corner, and there was a woman with a white sweater on her knees, praying with her head bowed. And the prayer kept going for a few minutes. It began to dawn on me that she was praying for help. And then it dawned on me that what she was praying for could not be granted. And a few minutes later, it came to me that the woman herself knew her prayer could not be granted, but she kept on praying because she had to. I still get emotional about it some 50 years later. And that's the kind of parishioners who visited the church. As far as the choir is concerned, since the church had 3 altars, 3 liturgies could be served in one day. When I turned 7 or 8, I began to sing in the church. The early liturgy on Sunday, I had virtually no parishioners in attendance, but Bishop John was always there on a small podium watching. There were novice deacons, novice priests, and visiting nuns and monks serving. And the 3 boys, I was one of them, soprano, alto, bass, took care to sing the entire liturgy from beginning to end. Now, Bishop John was there to supervise as a trainer in charge of the new people who would be let loose on the church and its parishioners in a short time. He would spot the slightest mistake, and using his cane or possak would tap and stop the service, but never give a clue as to what was wrong. The perpetrator had to correct himself, find the mistake, and rectify it. If another mistake was made in the rectifying process, back again to the tapping, and no help at all. It was a great learning situation. People learned fast and were extremely well trained. As far as the singing is concerned, the 3 of us boys were quite good musicians. We could read in Slavonic script and sing often from memory whatever had to be sung, and including the tropary and kontakin of the day. Big boys we sometimes gave to the temptation of trying Bishop John's patient by adding some embellishments to one of the voices and watching his face as a reaction. And the embellishments were spontaneous, but because we were good musicians, they really fitted quite well. I remember Bishop John noticing it immediately and frowning. But he never stopped us once, which he should have, because he felt, I thought, that this was our form of worship, and if he stopped us, we'd get inhibited. And by not stopping us, he hoped we would find our humility again and become better parishioners, and we did. That's a sample of his wisdom. By not stopping us, he did us more good than if he had reprimanded us. But he knew exactly the pranks we were up to, and he put up with it, bless his heart. In San Francisco, where the new cathedral was built, the Russian emigres were no longer as poor or persecuted as they were in Shanghai. And St. John had a much harder time keeping his parishioners in line, but he still managed quite well. Unfortunately, I was a student in UC Berkeley at that time and came very seldom to church. And my contact with St. John was primarily through the Russian Center, which was fairly close to the church and often visited by St. John to bless whatever functions they had. My family was instrumental in some fundraising, and as a pianist, I participated in these fundraising functions, all of which were blessed by St. John, then Bishop John Stoll, but not directly associated with his fundraising, but nevertheless with a tenuous connection. I believe that my participation in many of these efforts raised at least $100,000 for charity, for which I got the suitable gramatas and all kinds of decorations and crosses and honors, which I do wear sometimes. Nobody knows what they mean anymore. When St. John reposed, I was not there, but I did visit the crypt several times afterwards and conversed with him. My interaction with him was quite deep in my childhood, in the preteen age, casual in my adulthood, and then, much to my surprise, in the church we are in right now, his icon is the closest to where my wife and I sit. There are two chairs and none other that are available to anybody, and we're the closest to him when we enter, while we stay, and when we leave. The choir always had to ask permission from Bishop John as to the composed repertoire to be allowed in any particular service. Bishop John was particularly sensitive to what was sung for any particular feast or even any particular portion of the parishioners. As I've mentioned already, the parishioners in Shanghai were an extremely diversified group, a rather skittish and difficult group, and St. John was the great unifier and pacifier, so he had to take care of people's sensitivities and their likes and dislikes, which I'm sure he hated to do, but he had to, because the cathedral had to survive in basically a hostile environment, hostile politically, and hostile in terms of opposing views and forces within the immigrant community itself. He was particularly successful in it. So what we sang reflected that particular aspect of the realities of life. Now, one of the most devout parishioners I knew happened to be Georgy Kudinov, whose name is known today in all history books of Shanghai. He was an opera and light opera singer and had an enormous following. He would come to sing with the choir as soloist, and the doors were always open to him. He didn't have to rehearse. He could sight read anything, and he knew all the literature we ever sung, including the latest, such as Kostalsky, who stayed in Russia after the revolution and died there. Kudinov had an enormous following, and when he sang, people came in hordes to hear his glorious voice. We were all entranced and enthralled. When Kudinov was there, we would venture into territory which would be probably impossible or questionable today. The great sacred concertos by Bortniansky. Tchaikovsky himself edited 10 volumes of Bortniansky out of respect for Bortniansky, and the vocal concerti, which are sung before communion, are really Baroque music based on Baroque oratorios and chorales. They're glorious works, extremely difficult to sing, extremely well edited by Bortniansky, and extremely powerful. So, under these conditions, Bishop John would reluctantly allow music which would be considered operatic today to be sung, and we all loved it. Well, Bishop John, in the eyes of many, would be considered an eccentric. He disliked riding in cars or even streetcars. He felt that walking was appropriate, and he walked all over. When he came across a beggar without shoes, he would take off his shoes and continue on barefoot. He was known as the barefoot bishop. In France, he was called évêque nu-pieds, naked feet. Also, another habit that was somewhat disconcerting. When Bishop John had some urgent appointments and happened to pass a cemetery where people he knew well were buried, he would stop, postpone the appointment, go to the cemetery, visit every grave, and do a service personally, without help, all by himself at every single grave, much to the alarm of his companion, who said, "You missed the plane." And then Bishop John would say, "No, the plane will wait." And most of the time he was right. The plane was delayed, not because they'd waited for St. John, but because it had engine problems. So he seldom missed his plane. But he took enormous risks in order to satisfy what he felt was the needs of people living and dead.
Beautiful.
When the communist occupation of Shanghai became imminent, a lot of Russians were politically endangered by the Soviet government because of their past and had to escape. So Bishop John took 6,000 people to Tumabaon Island in the Philippines and stayed with them with daily prayers and daily servicing while making trips to the United States, persuading the Washington powers and banking on the new, about to be born United Nations to get safe passage to 6,000 people to the United States, and he succeeded. I met Father Seraphim Rose through my friend George Lednev, who was an engineer but had many interests in the Orthodox Church and other areas totally unconnected with the church, like Bali. He took me to Platina and introduced me to Father Seraphim. In those days, Platina was just beginning as a monastery. It was a strange experience because it was a totally wild place. No water. We had to carry water in buckets up an impossible hillside. There was no electricity to speak of, and we slept in zipped up bags to avoid scorpions, which were all around us. Father Seraphim himself was a charismatic person, very matter of fact. He never talked about his past or the future. He talked only about the present. He lived in the present moment. That was the moment to capitalize on and do things now, today. My job was to work with George in building some new cells. So I did what I was not accustomed to do, saw wood, carry wood, pounded nails, and so on. And Father Seraphim was working all around us, much faster than George, and George much faster than me. So I could see Father Seraphim gently frowning on my poor efforts. We had, of course, a lot of new monks and novices all around. Everybody was doing their work. We were in the middle of a new beginning. It was a difficult experience for me because I was not built to do hard physical work 8 hours a day or more, and then attend night services. On top of that, sleep sporadically, and but the experience was a jolting one, I would say. In summary, I found Father Seraphim a most fascinating person, riveting and hypnotic. As far as I know, he was a protege of Bishop John, who persuaded him or guided him or encouraged him in some ways to get Platina started. And there was this connection between the two, each of whom became a saint. My next relevant meeting with Father Seraphim, besides many sporadic meetings in various places, including Platina, but casual meetings, my next meeting was at his coffin. A strange thing happened. George Ledniff called me very early in the morning, almost in the middle of the night, to say I had a strange dream. I saw Father Seraphim in my dream striding uphill and saying, "George, I'm free now. I'm free and you cannot follow me." George said, "Father Seraphim must have died." And George knew before the news were announced. Father Seraphim announced it to George first, and George announced it to me. So we both knew he was dead before the rest of the world could be told. So I was prepared to go to the funeral, which I did. George was not there. So since he was employed and had a family to support, he had no choice. He was working for the U.S. government. The crowds were enormous, and the crowds pushed me right next to the coffin. And I stood by the coffin the whole duration of the funeral service. The funeral service was a jubilant one, like celebration of resurrection. I could see Father Seraphim's face, and I could touch his hands. They were soft, flexible, and not cold at all. And he looked in his coffin like he was ready to spring up and walk. An eerie feeling. There were the chapel, which I knew from my previous visits to Platina, was overfilled to capacity, and I was pressed against the coffin by the crowd. There were photographers all over the place, clicking their cameras on the coffin, and I prayed, saying, "Please preserve me from being in the center," since I was right there by the coffin. And believe it or not, not a single of those hundreds of photographs showed me. No, it's as if I never existed. Strange occurrence, but I don't know what made me say that prayer, but I did. And it was granted instantly. I have a feeling that Saint Seraphim and Saint John had something to do with it. It was their style, this type of gentle humor. Then my next visit to Platina was after the chapel was burned down, and it was quite a sight. The trees around the chapel were singed, but intact. It is as if the chapel was consumed as a burnt offering. An eerie experience. I've never seen anything like this in my life. Total destruction by fire, and everything around untouched. Now, I don't know what to make of this sign. Father Seraphim gave me some books, unfortunately unsigned. Maybe again he didn't want me was about it. So I still have his books, which I've read, and I'm waiting for his icon to appear in our house. St. John's icon is in our house. By the way, the Greek Church recognized the Romanovs as saints and St. John as saints before the Orthodox Church officially did. The Greek old calendarists knew their saints.